I was attending a church class one day on how to present your faith. This was not at my church, this was at another church where I feel that sometimes they tend to say things in a somewhat sloppy manner. Here's an example. In the course of this class, somebody naturally asked the question, what do you do in order to show someone why Christianity is worth believing? Now, people offered various answers, such as biblical prophecy and so forth and so on. But at one point, the pastor said, you know, if you can't remember these things, you can always offer your testimony, because nobody can deny your testimony. I'd like to disagree with that. And in addition, I'd like to point out various pitfalls to this approach. I'm not trying to dissuade people from offering their testimony. In fact, the Apostle Paul himself offered his testimony when he said that he used to be a persecutor of the faith, but now he was, a follower of Jesus Christ. But I think we can find ourselves in certain traps if we rely on this tactic too much, or rely on it without also being firmly rooted in other reasons for believing the faith. First, is it true that nobody can deny your testimony? I don't think so, and here's why. We deny other people's testimonies all the time. If someone claims to have been changed by Mormonism, or by transcendental meditation, or by some occult religion, we would be quick to say, wait a minute, were you really changed? Or ask, what is the nature of that change? Those are fair questions. By the same token, it's a fair question for people to ask a Christian believer, were you really changed? So I don't think it's true that nobody can deny your testimony. In fact, non-believers deny the testimonies of Christians all the time. One observation. I think that's especially true nowadays when you have had so many people, so many Christian clergy fall from grace, so to speak. If you were to ask someone, tell someone how Jesus Christ changed your life, a lot of people will respond by saying, yeah, right, let's give it a week, or let's give it a year and see where you are then. This is one reason, by the way, why I believe it's very important to maintain integrity in your Christian relationship, in your Christian conduct. Very difficult for us to do. I know that I fall short far more often than I care to, but it's something that I consider to be very important, and I trust that you do too, because you can do tremendous damage if you're not walking the walk. Here's another observation. Other people respond by saying, well, okay, that works for you, but who's to say that it would work for me? Remember, we live in a relativistic age, an age where people often deny absolute truth, where people often think that, what works for you doesn't work for me, and so forth and so on. Now, that's perfectly fine if you're talking about personal preferences like ice cream, or even, say, medications addressing different illnesses and so forth and so on. But people adopt that in a blanket way, as though to say, you need God in your life, that doesn't mean that I do. Again, I'm not trying to dissuade people from offering their testimony, but these are just some examples of how relying on that tactic can trip you up. Here's another reason why. Most of us do not have extremely dramatic testimonies. Most of us can't claim that Jesus Christ saved us from a life of drug abuse and promiscuity and so forth and so on. Now again, I'm not trying to dissuade people from offering their testimonies. I certainly have a testimony of my own. And I certainly know people who have very dramatic testimonies indeed, testimonies that will blow your mind. But most of us don't have that. And even if we do, a lot of us can't really articulate it in a very, how do you put it, in a particularly convincing way. This goes hand in hand with what I said earlier, by the way, about how a lot of people offer their Christian testimony and yet slip up. The two issues are related. You might have a testimony that's not all that dramatic. In my case, for example, I did not come from a life of drug abuse or sexual promiscuity, or I didn't even smoke or drink, but I have no doubt that Jesus changed my life. Having said that, that testimony is not as dramatic as what other people may say. And if I were to relate that story to someone, I'd have to be very careful in how I explain how Jesus changed my life. And it certainly would not be as compelling as some of these other stories that would blow your mind. So if you do offer your testimony, I urge you to pay special attention to how to present it in as convincing way as possible. It's great if you have some mind-blowing testimony to offer, but if you don't, you need to be extra careful. Second, recognize that people may just deny the validity of your testimony. Third, remember that people will be looking at your conduct as well. In other words, they'll be saying, okay, how are you going to be behaving a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 10 years from now? How will you behave tomorrow? And fourth, you need to be able to provide other reasons for believing the faith, not just your personal testimony. Here's why. Our testimonies are often somewhat subjective. We can talk about how Jesus changed our life, but communicating what that change is like and how it feels can be difficult. And if it's just a subjective testimony, that can make you look foolish. Oftentimes people talk about how Jesus Christ gave them so much peace in their hearts, and I don't deny that. The Bible does speak about the peace that surpasses all understanding, and I've experienced it. But it's something that a non-believer would often have a difficult time really grasping. Even someone who's open to the Christian faith would often have a hard time grasping that sort of thing. Not to mention that people also claim to derive peace from, say, yoga, or transcendental meditation, or the latest relaxation techniques, and so forth and so on. Here's another reason why that can be problematic. The Christian life will not always be peaceful. In fact, you can expect trials and tribulations. This leads to the fifth pitfall that I want to talk about. People often say, my life was so much better after becoming a Christian. Don't say that. Because if you do, what happens when this person encounters trials and tribulations? What happens when you encounter trials and tribulations and people see that? They're not going to think that your life is better. Now, in a sense it is, if you really are truly walking with the Lord and abiding in His peace and submitting to Him. But it's not going to look that way. If you can walk amidst those trials with tremendous peace, that's a wonderful testimony in itself, and that just might be very convincing to people. I've had to work up to that level of faith, and I'm not even there yet, really, I have to admit. But even then, a lot of people might say, wait a minute, is this person's life really all that much better? No matter how peaceful you are, some people will look at you and say, is this what becoming a Christian will do to me? Think about the Christians who are suffering in, say, North Korea or Sudan. They're not enjoying a life that's much better, at least not in the sense that the world would understand. So, remember, offering your testimony is valuable. I encourage people to do so, but don't rely on it as your primary means of communicating the faith, and recognize that there can be certain pitfalls associated with this approach. That's why I urge people to practice their testimony carefully and to be able to bolster it up with other good reasons for believing the word.